Today's good question, we're asking how binding is a guilty plea? We've recently seen several cases where defendants who had entered into plea agreements and in some cases had entered a guilty plea later asked to withdraw those pleas. I talked to defense attorney Abe Mashney. He echoed what we've seen in some of those recent cases. That process gets more unlikely the further into the case you go. If there hasn't been an actual guilty plea entered in court, then you just move on to trial. But if there has been a guilty plea entered, then a judge has to agree to let that suspect withdraw the plea. A hearing could be set for that process, and the defense would have to give a compelling reason why that plea should be withdrawn. As Mashney told me, buyer's remorse isn't an excuse to withdraw a plea. And if sentencing has already happened, getting that plea withdrawn would be even less likely. At that point, ineffective assistance is the most likely issue the defendant would raise, but a judge could deny that request and order that sentence to be carried out. Mashney told me there is a reason that judges ask defendants so many questions when taking a guilty plea. If you have a good question, you can email goodquestion@wkyt.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.